The scent of winter roses made my stomach turn. They were everywhere, woven into garlands that draped from the vaulted ceiling, crushed beneath the feet of nobles who didn't bother to watch where they stepped, their petals bruised and dying on the cold marble floor. The great hall of the northern court had been transformed into something out of a fever dream, all white silk and silver candlelight. Every surface polished until it reflected back the faces of those who belonged here. I didn't belong here. My fingers trembled as I adjusted the heavy tray balanced against my hip, the crystal glasses catching the light and throwing fractured rainbows across my plain gray uniform. Around me, the other servants moved with practiced efficiency, their movements a carefully choreographed dance I'd only begun to learn 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. That was all the time I'd had to prepare for today, for the most important ceremony the Northern Court had seen in over a century. The Alpha King was taking a bride. I could feel the weight of it in the air, thick and suffocating as smoke. Fear, that's what it was. Everyone in this hall was afraid, though they hid it behind painted smiles and jeweled masks. They feared him, the king whose very name sent shivers down spines, whose reputation for cold brutality had spread across every territory, every pack, every whispered conversation in dark corners. I'd never seen him. Not really. Just glimpses. A shadow moving through corridors. A figure too tall and too still to be entirely human, even by our standards. The other servants spoke of him in hushed tones, their eyes darting to doorways as if he might materialize from their words alone. Don't look at him directly, Martha had warned me that first day, her weathered hands gripping my shoulders hard enough to bruise. She was the head housekeeper, a woman who'd survived 30 years in this court, by knowing exactly when to speak and when to disappear. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't drop anything. Don't breathe too loud. And for the love of the moon, don't let him notice you exist. I'd nodded, swallowing down questions I knew better than to ask. Now, as I wove between clusters of visiting dignitaries and territorial alphas who'd come to witness this union, I kept my eyes down, focused on the geometric patterns of the floor. Black and white marble, arranged in a design that was supposed to represent balance, harmony. Everything this marriage was meant to symbolize. The bride, Lady Celestine of the Eastern Valleys, stood on the raised dais at the far end of the hall, positioned like a piece of art, meant to be admired but not touched. And she was beautiful, devastatingly so. Her dark hair had been arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken hours, woven through with strands of actual silver and dotted with tiny diamonds that caught the light with every slight movement. Her dress was a masterpiece of white lace and silk, cut to emphasize every curve, every line of her aristocratic breeding. She looked like a queen. She looked terrified. I could see it in the tension of her shoulders, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she accepted congratulations from a visiting lady. Her hands, clasped demurely in front of her, were white-knuckled with pressure. Everyone feared the Alpha King, even the woman who was about to become his wife. I made my way along the perimeter of the hall, refilling glasses, removing empty plates, making myself invisible. It was a skill I'd learned young, growing up in the outer villages where being noticed usually meant being hurt. My mother had died when I was 12, leaving me with nothing but her quick hands and quicker mind, both of which I'd inherited. My father had followed her 2 years later, his heart simply giving up one winter morning. After that, I'd been alone. The memory still ached, a hollow space in my chest that never quite filled, but I'd survived. I'd learned to read people, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to move through spaces like water, fluid and forgettable. "You there, girl?" The voice cut through my thoughts like a blade, sharp and imperious. I turned to find a woman in an elaborate purple gown, her face painted and powdered, one jeweled hand extended toward me with an empty glass. "Yes, my lady," I murmured, already moving to take it. "Not that one, you fool. That's been sitting out. I want a fresh one from the kitchen, and do hurry. The ceremony begins in less than an hour." Less than an hour. My pulse quickened. The actual binding ceremony, where the Alpha King would claim his bride before witnesses, sealing their union with blood and oath, and ancient words that predated even the oldest among us. I bobbed a quick curtsy and hurried toward the servants' passage, grateful for an excuse to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the hall. The narrow corridor was blissfully cool, lit by simple oil lamps rather than elaborate chandeliers. My footsteps echoed on the stone as I descended toward the kitchens, where chaos reigned. "Mind yourself," barked the head cook, a massive woman named Beatrice who ruled her domain with iron authority. "The first course needs to go up the moment the vows are complete, and if anything is cold, it'll be your heads." I grabbed a fresh tray of glasses and turned to head back up. But something made me pause. A sound, distant and strange, coming from deeper in the servants' quarters. A sob, muffled, as if someone was trying desperately to hold it in. I should have ignored it. Should have minded my own business and returned to the hall like I'd been instructed. But my feet carried me forward anyway, toward a small storage room at the end of the corridor. The door was slightly ajar, lamplight spilling through the crack. I pushed it open slowly. Lady Celestine sat on a wooden crate, her magnificent dress pooling around her like melted snow, her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, and the elaborate hairstyle had begun to come undone, silver threads hanging loose around her face. She looked up at the sound of the door, her eyes red and swollen, fear flashing across her features before recognition set in. Just a servant. No threat. "Get out," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I should have obeyed, but something in her face, in the desperate animal terror I recognized from my own reflection in harder times, kept me rooted in place. "My lady," I said softly, setting down the tray and closing the door behind me. "Are you—" I said, "Get out." She stood abruptly, and I saw her hands were shaking violently. "You don't understand. You can't understand. He's going to— I've heard the stories. What he did to the last woman who displeased him. What he does in the dark when no one's watching. I'm going to die in that hall tonight, or I'm going to wish I had." The words spilled out of her like poison, desperate and raw. I'd heard the stories too. Everyone had. The Alpha King's cruelty was legendary. Prisoners who vanished into his dungeons and were never seen again. Enemies who challenged him and were destroyed so thoroughly their own families couldn't identify the remains. A temper so volatile that even his most trusted advisors walked on eggshells in his presence. But I'd also heard other things, whispers from older servants who'd been here longer. Martha, in one of her rare unguarded moments, had mentioned that the king never raised his voice, that he was unfailingly courteous to the staff, that the dungeons hadn't housed a prisoner in over 3 years. The stories might not be true, I heard myself say. Lady Celestine laughed, a broken sound. "You're a fool if you believe that. Look at this place. Look at how everyone moves around him like he's a bomb waiting to explode. I've been in court my entire life, and I've never seen fear like this, not even from the cruelest lords. This is different. This is—" The door slammed open. A woman stood in the doorway, tall and elegant in a deep crimson gown that marked her as one of Lady Celestine's ladies-in-waiting. Her dark eyes swept over the scene, taking in her mistress's tear-stained face, the ruined hair, my presence. "My lady," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "The ceremony begins in 20 minutes. Your father is asking for you." "I can't," Lady Celestine whispered. "I can't do this. I won't." "You will." The woman's voice hardened. "You will compose yourself, fix your appearance, and you will go out there and fulfill your duty to your family and your territory. This union was negotiated for months. The contracts are signed. The witnesses are assembled. There is no escape." She turned to me then, and something cold flickered in her expression. "And you? What's your name?" "Elena," I said quietly. "Elena Winters." "Elena Winters." She tasted the name like it was poisonous. "How long have you worked here?" 3 weeks, my lady." 3 weeks. A smile curved her lips, sharp and calculated. How unfortunate. Before I could process what was happening, she'd grabbed Lady Celestine by the arm and hauled her to her feet. "Come, now. We'll fix this in your chambers." She pulled the sobbing bride toward the door, then paused, looking back at me over her shoulder. "You. Stay here. Someone will come for you." The door closed behind them with a final sounding click. I stood alone in the storage room, my heart hammering against my ribs, knowing with absolute certainty that I'd just made a terrible mistake. 20 minutes passed in suffocating silence. I'd tried to leave 3 times, but each time my hand touched the door handle, something stopped me. Fear, maybe. Or the bone-deep certainty that walking out of this room would somehow make things worse. So I waited, my back pressed against the cold stone wall, listening to the muffled sounds of the ceremony beginning overhead. The chanting started first, ancient words in a language that predated modern speech, their rhythm thrumming through the foundations of the castle like a second heartbeat. Then came the drums, deep and resonant, marking the formal procession. I could picture it perfectly even from down here. The Alpha King standing at the altar, his face unreadable, while Lady Celestine walked the long aisle on her father's arm, every eye in the hall tracking her movement. I wondered if she'd stopped crying. If they'd managed to repair her appearance, to paint over the evidence of her terror. I wondered what would happen to me. The door opened without warning. 2 guards stood in the doorway, their expressions blank and professional. They wore the king's colors, deep charcoal and silver, and moved with the fluid efficiency of trained warriors. Behind them stood the woman in crimson, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Elena Winters," she said, as if testing how my name would sound at a trial. "Come with us, please." It wasn't a request. I followed them through the servants' corridors, up narrow staircases I'd never used before, my mind racing through possibilities. Would they dismiss me? Send me back to the outer villages with nothing? Or worse, much worse, would they accuse me of something? Attempting to sabotage the ceremony, perhaps. Upsetting the bride. There were laws about such things, ancient and brutal. We emerged not into the great hall as I'd expected, but into a smaller chamber just off the main ceremony space. Through the partially open door, I could see the ritual in progress. Lady Celestine and the Alpha King stood facing each other on the dais, their hands bound together with a silver cord that gleamed in the candlelight. A priest in ceremonial robes chanted over them, marking their foreheads with blessed oil. The Alpha King was turned away from me, but I could see his silhouette, impossibly tall, shoulders broad beneath an elaborately embroidered coat. His dark hair was pulled back severely from his face, and he stood with absolute stillness, as if carved from stone. Lady Celestine swayed slightly, her face pale as death. "Wait here," one of the guards instructed, positioning himself by the door. The woman in crimson disappeared into the hall, moving with purpose toward a cluster of nobles near the front. I watched as she leaned close to an older man wearing a lord's insignia, whispering urgently in his ear. His face darkened. He turned to look in my direction, though I knew he couldn't actually see me from his angle. My stomach dropped. The ceremony continued. The priest raised his voice for the final vows, the words echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Do you, Celestine of the Eastern Valleys, pledge yourself to—" "I can't!" The 2 words cut through the formal proceedings like a scream. Lady Celestine had jerked her bound hand away from the Alpha King, stumbling backward on the dais. Her carefully constructed composure had shattered completely, tears streaming down her face, her breath coming in panicked gasps. "I can't do this. I won't. I don't care about the contracts or the treaties or any of it. I won't marry a monster." The hall erupted into chaos. Nobles surged to their feet, voices rising in shock and outrage. The priest looked stricken, the sacred cord dangling uselessly from his hands. Lady Celestine's father pushed through the crowd, his face purple with rage, and the Alpha King stood absolutely motionless at the center of it all, his expression, from what little I could see of his profile, completely blank. "Celestine." Her father reached the dais, grabbing her arm. "What are you doing? Have you lost your mind?" She was convinced to do this. The woman in crimson's voice rang out clear and cold, cutting through the noise. She pointed directly at the doorway where I stood hidden, by that servant, the new girl. I found her in the storage rooms, filling my lady's head with lies about the king, telling her she should refuse the marriage, that she should run. Every head in the hall turned toward me. No, that wasn't what happened. I'd barely said anything at all. The guards hauled me forward into the light, their grips iron tight on my arms. I stumbled, my gray servant's uniform a stark contrast to the elaborate finery surrounding me. 1,000 eyes fixed on my face, and I felt the weight of their judgment like physical blows. Is this true? The voice came from the dais, and it took me a moment to realize the Alpha King had spoken. His voice was nothing like I'd expected. Not a growl or a roar, but something quiet and precise. Each word carefully shaped. He still hadn't turned to look at me directly. No, I managed, my voice barely audible. I found Lady Celestine upset, but I didn't tell her to refuse. I wouldn't. She's lying. The woman in crimson pointed an accusing finger. I heard her myself. She was poisoning my lady's mind against you, Your Majesty, filling her head with terrible stories. She's clearly a spy, sent by one of your enemies to sabotage this union. A spy. The accusation hung in the air, deadly serious. Spies were executed. I'm not, I said desperately, looking around at the sea of hostile faces. I'm just a servant. I've only been here 3 weeks. I don't know anything about politics or treaties. Silence her, Lady Celestine's father demanded. This is clearly a conspiracy to undermine the alliance between our territories. I demand justice, Your Majesty. The Alpha King finally moved. He turned slowly, deliberately, and for the first time I saw his face fully. Sharp features, almost severe in their precision. High cheekbones. A mouth set in a hard line. And eyes. Dark eyes that seemed to look straight through skin and bone to whatever lay beneath. Those eyes fixed on me, and the world contracted to just that single point of contact. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. There was something in his gaze that wasn't quite human. Something ancient and powerful and utterly alien. This was what an apex predator looked like when it focused its complete attention on prey. I should have looked away. Should have dropped my eyes submissively like every instinct screamed at me to do. But I didn't. I held his gaze because some stubborn part of me, the part that had survived losing everything, that had clawed my way up from nothing, refused to be crushed without at least being seen. If I was going to die for a crime I didn't commit, then he was going to have to actually look at me while he ordered it. Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe. Or curiosity. What is your name? He asked. Elena Winters, Your Majesty. And you have been employed here for 3 weeks? Yes, Your Majesty. In what capacity? General housekeeping. Serving during events. Whatever is needed. My voice steadied slightly. I work under Martha, the head housekeeper. He was quiet for a long moment, studying me with that unsettling intensity. Then he looked at the woman in crimson. And you witnessed this supposed sabotage personally? Yes, Your Majesty. I heard her speaking to Lady Celestine, telling her not to go through with the ceremony. What exactly did she say? The woman hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. She said that you were cruel, that the stories about you were true, that my lady would be better off dead than married to you. I didn't say that, I interrupted, knowing it was dangerous but unable to stop myself. I said the stories might not be true. That's all. Lady Celestine was already upset when I found her. I stopped, realizing too late that explaining her terror would only make things worse. She was what? The Alpha King prompted, his voice still that same careful, neutral tone. I met his eyes again. Afraid, Your Majesty. She was afraid of you. The assembled nobles gasped at my bluntness. Lady Celestine's father looked apoplectic. But the Alpha King simply nodded, as if I'd confirmed something he already knew. Of course she was. Everyone is afraid of me. He said it without inflection, a simple statement of fact. Then he turned to Lady Celestine, who had collapsed into a chair, still weeping. And you? Do you wish to proceed with this marriage? She looked up at him, her face blotchy and swollen. No, she whispered. Please, I can't. Very well. He reached up and unclasped the elaborate coat he wore, handing it to a stunned attendant. Beneath it, he wore a simple black shirt that somehow made him look even more dangerous. The ceremony is ended. The contract is void. The hall exploded. You can't. Lady Celestine's father started forward. I can. And I have. The Alpha King's voice didn't rise, but something in it made every person in the room fall silent. I will not force a woman who is terrified of me to bind herself to me for life. The negotiations were made in good faith, but circumstances have changed. I will arrange appropriate compensation for your family's time and expense, Lord Ravencroft, but there will be no marriage today. He descended from the dais with fluid grace, moving through the parted crowd like water. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. He stopped directly in front of me. Up close, he was overwhelming, not just in size, though he towered over me by at least a foot, but in presence. Power radiated from him like heat from a forge, and I had to lock my knees to keep from stumbling backward. You, he said quietly, told her the stories might not be true. It wasn't a question, but I nodded anyway. Why? Because... I swallowed hard. Because fear without evidence is just rumor, Your Majesty. And I've learned that rumors are usually wrong. His eyes searched my face, looking for something. You're not afraid of me. I am, I admitted, because lying to him seemed impossibly stupid. But I'm afraid of a lot of things. It doesn't mean I let it control me. A sound escaped him. Not quite a laugh, but close. What is your position in this household? I'm just a maid, Your Majesty. Not anymore. He turned to address the room at large, his voice carrying easily across the shocked silence. This ceremony is concluded. The guests may depart or remain for the prepared feast as they choose. Lord Ravencroft, I will meet with you tomorrow to discuss terms. Lady Celestine, you are free to return to your territory with my blessing. Then he looked back at me, and something in his expression shifted, became less guarded, more calculating. Elena Winters, you will report to the king's private quarters tomorrow morning. You have a new assignment. Before I could ask what that meant, he walked away, his guards falling into formation around him, and disappeared through a side exit. I stood frozen in the center of the great hall, every eye still fixed on me, my heart hammering so hard I could barely hear the whispered conversations that erupted around me. What had just happened? And what, exactly, had I just been assigned to do? I didn't sleep that night. The other servants had avoided me after the ceremony's spectacular collapse, treating me like I carried some contagious disease. Martha had found me in the kitchens near midnight, her expression torn between sympathy and exasperation. What were you thinking? She'd hissed, pulling me into a quiet corner. Speaking to Lady Celestine like that? Getting involved? I wasn't thinking, I'd admitted. She was crying and you just couldn't help yourself. Martha had sighed, her weathered hands gripping my shoulders the same way they had on my first day. You've got your mother's heart, girl, too soft for your own good. Now you've caught the king's attention. And she'd trailed off, shaking her head. That's either the best thing that could happen to you, or the worst. Time will tell which. Now, as dawn light filtered through the small window of the servants' quarters I shared with 3 other maids, I stared at the cracked ceiling and tried to steady my breathing. Report to the king's private quarters. The words had echoed in my mind all night, each repetition spawning new fears. What kind of assignment? Would I be questioned further about yesterday? Punished for my interference, despite his seeming dismissal of the accusations? Or, and this thought made my stomach clench, was this something else entirely? I'd heard stories about powerful men who took an interest in certain servants, and those stories never ended well. You should go, whispered Margot, one of my roommates, from her cot across the narrow room. She was a few years younger than me, with kind eyes and a tendency to gossip. It's nearly 6. The king rises early. I nodded, rising to splash cold water on my face from the basin we shared. My reflection in the tarnished mirror looked pale and drawn, my ash-blonde hair tangled from a night of restless tossing. I braided it quickly, pinning it back in the simple style servants wore, and smoothed down my gray uniform. My hands were shaking. The castle was already awake when I stepped into the corridors, though most of the visiting nobles had departed in the night, fleeing the scandal like rats from a sinking ship. Regular staff moved through their morning routines, sweeping, dusting, preparing breakfast trays. A few glanced my way with undisguised curiosity, but no one spoke to me. The king's private wing was in the north tower, a section of the castle I'd never entered before. 2 guards stood at the entrance, their expressions professionally blank. One of them, the same guard who'd escorted me yesterday, gave me a brief nod of recognition. Elena Winters? Yes, follow me. The corridors here were different from the rest of the castle, quieter. The stone walls were hung with tapestries depicting ancient battles and forgotten kings, their colors still rich despite obvious age. Windows overlooked the northern mountains, their peaks still crowned with snow, even though spring had officially arrived. Everything felt older here, more deliberate, as if this part of the castle existed slightly outside normal time. We climbed a spiral staircase, passing several closed doors before stopping at one carved with an intricate pattern of wolves running beneath a full moon. The guard knocked once, then pushed it open. "Your Majesty, Elena Winters, as requested." "Send her in." I stepped through the doorway, my heart in my throat, and found myself in a study rather than a bedroom. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, their spines worn with use. A massive desk dominated one corner, covered in maps and correspondence. The morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air. The Alpha King stood by one of those windows, his back to me, hands clasped behind him. He'd changed from yesterday's formal attire into simple dark trousers and a white shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. Without the elaborate coat and ceremonial trappings, he looked almost human, though the power radiating from him hadn't diminished at all. "Close the door," he said without turning. I did, the soft click seeming impossibly loud in the quiet room. "Do you know why you're here, Elena?" My name in his voice sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. "No, Your Majesty. Neither do I. Entirely." He turned then, and I was struck again by his face in full light. He wasn't classically handsome. His features were too sharp, too intense for that. But there was something compelling about him. Something that drew the eye and held it. I made the decision impulsively last night, which is unlike me. I've been trying to determine if it was wisdom or foolishness ever since. He moved to his desk, gesturing for me to come closer. I did, carefully maintaining a respectful distance. "You said something yesterday that interested me," he continued, picking up a letter from the pile on his desk. "You said that fear without evidence is just rumor, that rumors are usually wrong. Do you believe that?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "Why?" I hesitated, trying to find words for something I'd always felt instinctively, because people are afraid of what they don't understand. And when they're afraid, they fill in the gaps with worst-case scenarios. Sometimes they're right, but mostly they're just making stories to explain their fear. He set down the letter, studying me with that same unsettling intensity. "And you think the stories about me are just that? Made-up explanations for fear?" "I don't know you well enough to say, Your Majesty." I met his eyes, remembering how he'd responded yesterday when I refused to look away. "But I know that people were terrified of you before you did anything. That suggests the fear came first, and the stories followed." Something that might have been approval flickered across his face. "You're perceptive and brave, which is either admirable or suicidal. I haven't decided which yet." He moved around the desk, and my pulse quickened as he came closer. But he simply pulled out a chair, gesturing for me to sit. When I did, awkwardly, because servants didn't sit in the presence of royalty, he leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "I'm going to tell you something that very few people know," he said. "And then I'm going to make you an offer. You may refuse if you wish, though I hope you won't." "I'm listening, Your Majesty." "The stories about me are largely fabricated. Not entirely. I've done things in war that would give anyone nightmares, and I don't apologize for protecting my territory by any means necessary. But the rumors of casual cruelty, of prisoners tortured for amusement, of servants disappearing in the night, those are lies. Carefully constructed lies spread by my own people." I blinked, not understanding. "Why would you want people to believe such things?" "Because fear is a weapon," he said simply. "A ruler who is feared faces fewer challenges than one who is loved. Rebels think twice before acting. Rival territories hesitate before declaring war, and within my own court, those who might scheme against me are kept off balance, never quite sure what I'm capable of." "But you're alone," I said, before I could stop myself. "Everyone's afraid to even look at you." His expression shifted, just for a moment, something raw and honest breaking through the careful control. "Yes, I am alone." That is the price of this particular strategy, and one I've been willing to pay. Until yesterday. What happened yesterday? I saw my future bride look at me with absolute terror, and I realized that I couldn't do it. Couldn't bind myself to someone who would spend every day of our lives together flinching from my shadow. Couldn't pretend that kind of fear was the foundation for anything but misery. He pushed off from the desk, pacing to the window. The marriage was meant to be political, an alliance. I didn't expect love or even affection, but I also didn't expect to see the look in Celestine's eyes and feel. He trailed off, and I waited, barely breathing. Feel like a monster, he finished quietly. The vulnerability in those words struck me like a physical blow. This was the Alpha King everyone feared, admitting to something achingly human. "You're not a monster," I said, and his head turned sharply toward me. "Monsters don't release people who are afraid of them. Monsters don't care about misery or loneliness. You made a choice yesterday that hurt you politically and probably caused significant diplomatic damage. That's not what a monster does." He stared at me for a long moment, and I watched something in his expression shift, walls lowering just slightly. "You really believe that?" "I do. Even though you barely know me, even though I could prove you wrong in an instant." "You could," I agreed. "But I don't think you will." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. Then he moved back to his desk, pulling out a document covered in dense script. "Here is my offer," he said. "I need someone in my household who isn't afraid of me. Someone who will speak honestly, rather than telling me what they think I want to hear. Someone who can move through the castle and report back on what people are really saying, really thinking, without the filter of terror. You demonstrated yesterday that you're capable of honesty even in dangerous situations, and you're new enough that you haven't been contaminated by years of fear-based conditioning." He set the document down in front of me. "I'm offering you a position as my personal attendant. You would serve me directly, managing my private quarters, accompanying me to certain events, acting as a liaison between myself and the general staff. The pay is substantially higher than your current position, and you would have private rooms in this wing. In exchange, I ask for complete honesty. If you see me acting like the monster everyone believes me to be, you tell me. If you hear something in the servants' quarters that I need to know, you report it. If you think I'm making a mistake, you say so." My mind reeled. Personal attendant, private rooms, direct access to the most powerful and feared man in the territory. "Why me?" I asked. "There must be dozens of people more qualified, more experienced." "There are," he agreed. "But they're all terrified of me. You're not. Or at least your fear doesn't stop you from being honest. That's worth more than experience." I looked at the document, then back at him. "And if I refuse, then you return to your current position with no penalty. This conversation never happened. I'll find someone else, though I doubt they'll be as suitable." He tilted his head slightly. "But I don't think you'll refuse. Why not?" "Because you're curious, and because despite your fear, you want to help. I saw it yesterday when you tried to comfort Celestine. You have a healer's instinct. You see pain, and you want to fix it. Even when that pain belongs to the Alpha King." He was right, and we both knew it. I thought of my mother, who'd spent her life helping others in our village, who'd taught me that power without compassion was just tyranny, but compassion without courage was worthless. She would have told me to be careful. She would have also told me to be brave. I picked up the document, scanning the formal language. The terms were exactly as he'd described. Generous salary, private quarters, direct service to the king. At the bottom was a line for my signature. "I have one condition," I said. His eyebrows rose slightly. "You're negotiating with me? You said you wanted honesty. That starts now." I met his eyes steadily. "If I do this, if I take this position, you have to promise me something. When you're alone, when it's just us in your private quarters, you drop the mask. No carefully constructed fear. No political maneuvering. Just truth. I can't help you if I don't actually know you." For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then, slowly, he extended his hand across the desk. "Agreed." I took his hand. His grip was warm and firm, and I felt the calluses on his palm. evidence that despite his royal status, he trained regularly with weapons. We shook once, formally sealing the agreement. "Welcome to my service, Elena Winters," he said, releasing my hand. "I hope neither of us regrets this decision." "So do I, Your Majesty, and when we're alone," he added, something almost like humor touching his voice, "you may call me Demon." The name suited him, strong and slightly dangerous, with edges that could cut if you weren't careful. I signed the document with a hand that barely trembled at all. The next 3 weeks transformed my entire world. My new quarters were in the east wing of the king's private tower, a suite of rooms that felt impossibly luxurious compared to the cramped servants' dormitory I'd left behind. A bedroom with an actual bed frame and thick quilts, a small sitting area with a fireplace, even a private washroom with running water. The first night I'd stood in the doorway for 10 minutes, convinced there'd been some mistake, but there was no mistake. This was my life now. The work itself was demanding, but not in the ways I'd expected. Demon, I still stumbled over using his name, even in private, kept odd hours, often working late into the night on correspondence and territorial matters. He ate irregularly, frequently forgetting meals when deep in concentration, and he moved through the castle with a deliberate isolation that became more apparent the longer I observed him. He was lonely, desperately, achingly lonely, though he hid it behind layers of careful control. I'd discovered this on my 4th day, when I'd entered his study to find him standing at the window at 2 a.m, his forehead pressed against the cold glass, shoulders tight with tension. He hadn't heard me come in, and for just a moment, his mask had slipped completely. The expression on his face had been raw and wounded, the look of someone who'd been strong for so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to rest. Then he'd sensed my presence, and the walls had slammed back into place. "Can't sleep?" I'd asked quietly, not mentioning what I'd seen. "Rarely can." He'd turned, his face carefully neutral again. "You should be resting, Elena. Your shift doesn't start until morning." "I heard you moving around. Thought you might want tea." I'd brought him tea every night since then. We'd fallen into a routine. I would arrive around midnight with a tray, and we would sit in his study while he worked, sometimes talking, sometimes existing in comfortable silence. He'd begun asking my opinion on small things at first, whether a letter sounded too harsh, if a particular policy would affect the servants unfairly. Then larger things, territorial disputes, trade negotiations, matters of court politics I barely understood but tried my best to follow. True to his word, he was honest with me when we were alone, not completely unguarded. I suspected that would take time, if it ever happened at all, but honest. He explained the careful political calculations behind decisions that seemed arbitrary. He admitted to doubts and uncertainties he never showed anyone else. And slowly, carefully, I began to understand the man beneath the reputation. He wasn't cruel, but he was ruthless when necessary. And he'd learned to weaponize fear because it was more efficient than violence. He didn't enjoy being feared, but he'd accepted it as the price of keeping his territory safe and stable. And he was so very, very tired. "You're thinking too loud," Demon said, breaking through my thoughts. I looked up from where I'd been polishing the silver tea service, a task I'd insisted on doing myself, much to his amusement, to find him watching me from his desk, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. It was early afternoon, sunlight streaming through the windows, and he'd finally agreed to take a break from the mountain of paperwork that never seemed to diminish. "Sorry," I said, setting down the cloth, "just wondering about something." "Ask." It had become our pattern. He wanted questions, encouraged them, said that my outsider's perspective helped him see blind spots he might otherwise miss. "The council meeting yesterday," I began carefully. "Lord Thorne challenged your decision about the northern border patrols, but you didn't argue with him. You just stared at him until he backed down. Why?" Demon leaned back in his chair, considering. "Because Lord Thorne is a political creature. He doesn't actually disagree with my decision. The increased patrols are clearly necessary given recent incursions. He challenged me because he needs to maintain his image as someone who stands up to me. Someone with backbone. So you let him?" "I let him make his challenge, knowing he would back down. He gets to look brave in front of the other lords. I get my policy implemented without argument. and the court is reminded that even the boldest among them eventually defers to me. Everyone wins. I shook my head, bemused. Politics are exhausting. They are, he agreed, standing and moving to the window. It was his habit when he needed to think. This pacing to the windows and back. But necessary. Fear alone isn't enough to maintain power. You need to give people occasional glimpses of weakness. Let them believe they have some agency. Then when you assert your will, it seems more reasonable rather than tyrannical. Is everything calculated with you? I asked, and immediately worried I'd overstepped, but he just smiled. That rare, genuine expression that transformed his entire face. Not everything. My decision to hire you, for instance, that was pure impulse. Are you regretting it? No. He turned to face me fully. You're the best decision I've made in years, actually. The castle feels less empty, and I've noticed I'm sleeping better. The admission made warmth bloom in my chest, unexpected and dangerous. I'd been trying very hard not to examine my feelings too closely, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to deny that something was shifting between us. The long nights talking over tea, the moments of shared humor, the way his face softened when he looked at me. All of it was weaving something complicated and fragile. I was developing feelings for him. Real ones, beyond simple attraction or gratitude for my new position. And from the way he watched me sometimes, his dark eyes tracking my movements with an intensity that had nothing to do with professional assessment, I suspected he felt something too, but I was a servant. He was a king, and no amount of feeling would change that fundamental imbalance. Elena. His voice had dropped lower, more intimate. I need to attend a function tonight, a dinner with visiting dignitaries from the Southern Territories. I'd like you to accompany me. My stomach flipped. As your attendant? As... He hesitated, and I saw uncertainty flicker across his features. As someone I trust, the Southern Lords are testing the waters, seeing if my failed engagement has weakened my position. They'll be looking for any sign of instability, any crack they can exploit. Having you there would help. How? Because you're not afraid of me. Because you'll speak to me naturally, without the weight of fear that everyone else carries. The Southern Lords will notice that, and it will unsettle them, make them question their assumptions. He moved closer, and I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I would simply like you there. These functions are tedious and full of political maneuvering. Your presence would make it more bearable. The honesty in that statement, the admission of need, sent my pulse racing. All right, I agreed. What should I wear? His expression shifted to something almost embarrassed. I took the liberty of having some dresses made for you. For situations like this, they're in your wardrobe. If you don't like them, or if this feels too presumptuous, I can... Demon, I interrupted gently. It's fine. Thank you. The relief on his face was endearing. That evening, as I prepared in my quarters, I discovered what he'd meant by some dresses. My wardrobe now contained a dozen gowns, each one clearly expensive and tailored to my measurements. How he'd obtained those measurements I didn't want to know. But the dresses were beautiful, simple enough not to outshine any noble ladies present, but fine enough that I wouldn't look out of place at a formal dinner. I chose a deep blue gown with silver embroidery at the hem and neckline. It fit perfectly, the fabric flowing around me like water. I left my hair down rather than in its usual servant's braid, letting the pale blonde waves fall loose around my shoulders. When I met Demon outside the formal dining hall, his reaction was immediate and unguarded. His eyes widened slightly, his gaze traveling over me with undisguised appreciation. You look beautiful, he said, then seemed to catch himself. I mean, appropriate. You look appropriately dressed for the occasion. I bit back a smile at his awkwardness. Thank you, Your Majesty. Demon, he corrected quietly. At least while we're alone. But we weren't alone for long. The doors opened, and we entered the dining hall together. The Southern Lords, 5 of them, all older men with calculating eyes and political smiles, rose to greet us. Their gazes swept over me with obvious curiosity, taking in my presence at the king's side. Gentlemen, Demon said smoothly, his public persona sliding into place like armor. May I present Elena Winters, my personal attendant and advisor. Advisor. He'd elevated my position without asking, and I saw the Southern Lords reassessing me immediately. The dinner was exactly as tedious as Demon had predicted. The Lords probed delicately at various topics: the broken engagement, the stability of the Northern Territories, potential trade agreements. Demon deflected and redirected with practiced ease, revealing nothing while seeming to be perfectly open. I remained quiet for most of it, observing. But when Lord Carver, the eldest of the Southern delegation, made a thinly veiled comment about the king's inability to secure a marriage alliance, I couldn't help myself. Perhaps, I said quietly, and every eye turned to me. His Majesty simply has higher standards than most, quality over expedience, as it were. There was a moment of shocked silence. Servants, even elevated ones, didn't speak at formal dinners unless directly addressed. Then Demon laughed, the sound genuine and warm. Elena is quite right. I'd rather rule alone than rule beside someone who sees me as a burden to be endured. Lord Carver's expression tightened, but he forced a smile. Of course, Your Majesty, though surely loneliness is also a burden. It can be, Demon agreed, his eyes finding mine across the table. But I've found recently that the right company makes all the difference. Quality, as my advisor says, over expedience. The heat in his gaze made my breath catch. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of political maneuvering and careful conversation, but I was hyper-aware of Demon beside me, of the way his hand occasionally brushed mine when passing dishes, of how he included me in discussions with a respect that clearly unsettled the Southern Lords. When it finally ended, and the dignitaries departed to their guest quarters, Demon escorted me back toward his wing of the castle. We walked in silence through empty corridors, and I could feel the tension building between us like electricity before a storm. You were perfect tonight, he said finally, stopping outside my door. The way you handled Lord Carver, that was brilliant. I probably shouldn't have spoken, I admitted. It wasn't my place. You're my advisor. It's exactly your place. He reached out, and I held my breath as his fingers gently tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. The gesture was tender, intimate, and completely inappropriate for a king to make to his servant. Elena, he said softly, his hand lingering near my face. I need to tell you something. My heart hammered against my ribs. What? I'm trying very hard to maintain appropriate boundaries with you, to remember the difference in our positions, the power imbalance, all the very good reasons why I should keep my distance. His thumb brushed across my cheekbone. Featherlight. But it's becoming increasingly difficult. Why? I whispered. Because somewhere in the last 3 weeks, I've started falling for you. The confession came out rough and honest. And I hope, you might feel the same way. I should have denied it, should have protected us both from this dangerous path. Instead, I reached up and covered his hand with mine, pressing it more firmly against my cheek. I do, I admitted. But Demon, this is complicated. I know. He stepped closer, and I could feel the heat radiating from him. But I'm tired of being alone, tired of everyone being afraid of me except you. And I think maybe we could figure this out together. Before I could respond, before I could think about all the reasons this was dangerous and forbidden and impossible, he leaned down and kissed me. It was gentle at first, questioning, giving me every opportunity to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I rose on my toes and kissed him back, my hands fisting in his shirt, 3 weeks of tension and longing pouring into that single point of contact. He made a low sound in his throat and pulled me closer, one arm wrapping around my waist while his other hand tangled in my hair. The kiss deepened, became desperate and hungry, years of isolation and loneliness driving us both. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine. Stay with me tonight, he whispered. Just stay. I don't want to be alone. I should have said no. Should have maintained the professional distance that was already dangerously eroded. But I nodded instead and let him lead me into his chambers, into whatever complicated future we were building together. 2 months had passed since that first kiss, and the castle had begun to notice. Servants whispered when I walked by, their eyes tracking the fine dresses I now wore regularly, the way I moved freely through the king's private wing at all hours. The council members watched me with varying degrees of suspicion and calculation during meetings I now attended openly at Demon's side, and the visiting nobles who came for audiences looked between us with barely concealed speculation. We hadn't made any formal announcements, hadn't defined what we were to each other in any official capacity, but the truth was written in every shared glance, every unconscious touch, every moment. Demon's carefully controlled expression softened when he looked at me. I was no longer just his attendant. I was something more, something the court didn't quite have words for yet. "You're thinking too loud again," Demon murmured from where he sat at his desk, not looking up from the report he was reviewing. It was late afternoon, and we were in his study as usual. I'd been attempting to read through a stack of correspondence from the Eastern Territories, but my mind kept wandering to the problem that had been growing more pressing with each passing day. "We need to talk about this," I said, setting down the letters. "About what people are saying. I know what they're saying." He finally looked up, his dark eyes finding mine. "Does it bother you?" "Not the gossip itself, but—" I hesitated, trying to find the right words. "You're the Alpha King. Eventually, you'll need to marry someone appropriate. Form the political alliance that fell through with Celestine, and when that happens, I'm not marrying anyone else." The flat certainty in his voice made my breath catch. "Demon, you have to. The council expects many things that they won't receive." He stood, moving around the desk to where I sat. "I told you I was falling for you 2 months ago. That hasn't changed. If anything, it's gotten worse, or better, depending on your perspective." He pulled me to my feet, his hands warm on my arms. "I don't want a political alliance. I don't want someone who will tolerate me for the sake of power or territory. I want you. Just you." "But I'm nobody," I protested, even as my heart soared at his words. "I have no family connections, no political value. Choosing me would be the first truly selfish thing I've done in my entire reign." A smile curved his lips, "and I find I don't care. Let them whisper. Let the council disapprove. I've spent years being what everyone needed me to be. I think I've earned the right to choose my own happiness." Before I could respond, a sharp knock interrupted us. Demon's expression shifted instantly to his public face, all softness vanishing behind careful control. "Enter." The door opened to reveal Marcus, Demon's head advisor, a shrewd man in his 50s who'd served the crown for decades. His expression was grave. "Your Majesty, we have a situation. The western border. There's been an attack. Raiders from across the mountains. They've taken out 2 of our patrol stations and are moving toward Millbrook Village." Demon's entire body went rigid. "How many?" "Reports suggest at least 50, possibly more. They're well armed and organized. This isn't a random raid. It's coordinated. Assemble the guard. I want 100 soldiers ready to ride within the hour." Demon was already moving, his mind clearly racing through tactical considerations. "Send word to Colonel Reeves. He's to take command of the defense while I—" "Your Majesty," Marcus interrupted carefully, "the council believes you should remain here. Send the troops, but don't go yourself. It could be a trap designed to draw you out." "My people are in danger," Demon said, his voice dropping to something cold and dangerous. "I'm not hiding in my castle while they're slaughtered. But if something happens to you, then the succession protocols activate and the crown passes accordingly. We've planned for this." He strode toward his private chambers, clearly intending to change into armor. "I'm going, Marcus. That's final." I watched the exchange with growing dread. Demon was powerful, yes, one of the strongest alphas in generations. But 50 armed raiders, possibly more, with tactical coordination? That wasn't a simple border skirmish. That was a military operation. And something about it felt wrong. "Wait," I said, and both men turned to look at me. "Marcus, you said the raids took out 2 patrol stations and are heading toward Millbrook?" "Yes." "But that doesn't make sense." I moved to the large map of the territory that hung on the study wall, tracing the route with my finger. Millbrook is a farming village, small, poor, no strategic value. If you wanted to actually damage the territory, you'd hit the mining operations here, or the trade route here. Why waste a coordinated attack on farmers? Marcus frowned. Perhaps they're gathering supplies. Or it's bait. Demon finished, his eyes sharp on the map. Draw me out to protect civilians. Ambush me on the road where I'm vulnerable. But who would attempt such a thing? Marcus asked. And how would they know you'd respond personally? Because everyone knows I would. Demon's jaw tightened. I've built my reputation on protecting my people. It's predictable, which means it's exploitable. He looked at me, something like pride and concern mixing in his expression. Good catch. But it doesn't change the fundamental problem. Those villages still need help, whether it's a trap or not. Then don't give them what they expect, I said. Send Colonel Reeves with the main force to handle the raiders directly. You take a smaller team and come from a different direction. If it is an ambush, you'll catch them off guard. Demon considered this, then nodded slowly. Marcus, new plan. Reeves takes 80 soldiers and approaches from the main road. Make it obvious, lots of banners and noise. I'll take 20 of our best and circle around through the northern pass. If there's an ambush waiting, we'll hit them from behind. And if there's not? Marcus asked. Then we've still saved Millbrook, just with better tactics. He looked at me. You're staying here. No. His eyes widened slightly. Elena, you said you wanted my honest counsel. Here it is. You're walking into a dangerous situation, and you need someone with you who thinks differently than a soldier. Someone who might see things they miss. I'm coming. Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. And you're the Alpha King. Everything is dangerous. I crossed my arms. I'm not asking permission, Demon. I'm telling you I'm coming. You can waste time arguing with me, or you can accept it and plan accordingly. For a moment, I thought he'd refuse. Then something shifted in his expression. Resignation mixed with exasperation, mixed with affection. You're impossible, he muttered. You like that about me. Unfortunately, I do. He turned to Marcus. Fine. Elena comes with my group, but she stays back from any actual fighting. Non-negotiable. Marcus looked between us with barely concealed surprise, but nodded. As you wish, Your Majesty. I'll make the arrangements. An hour later, I found myself on horseback for the first time in years, dressed in practical riding clothes Demon had somehow procured, following 20 elite soldiers through the darkening forest. Demon rode beside me, his armor catching the last rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. Are you frightened? He asked quietly. Terrified, I admitted. But I meant what I said. You need different perspectives, especially in situations like this. What I need is for you to be safe. His hand found mine briefly, squeezed. But I understand why you're here. Just stay close to me. Please. We rode in silence after that, the forest growing darker as night fell. The northern pass was narrow and treacherous, barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast. If anyone was going to ambush us, this would be the perfect place, but we emerged without incident into the valley beyond, where Millbrook sat nestled among fields that should have been peaceful. Instead, smoke rose from several buildings and the orange glow of fire lit the night sky. Spread out, Demon ordered quietly. Remember, we're the surprise. Don't engage until my signal. The soldiers melted into the darkness with practiced efficiency. Demon and I dismounted, moving closer on foot. From our vantage point on a small hill, we could see the village below. The raiders were there, exactly as reported, armed men in mismatched armor, clearly mercenaries rather than an organized military force. They were herding villagers into the central square, separating families, shouting orders in accents I didn't recognize. But something was wrong. The raiders kept looking toward the main road. Weapons ready, positioned defensively rather than aggressively. They were waiting for something. It is a trap, I whispered. They're expecting your main force. Demon nodded grimly, which means Reeves is riding into an ambush. We need to... A horn blast cut through the night, the signal that the main force had arrived. Immediately, the forest on the far side of the village erupted with movement. More raiders, easily another 50, pouring out of concealment to catch Reeves's troops between 2 forces. But Demon was already moving. Now! He shouted, and our 20 soldiers charged down the hill, hitting the raiders from their undefended flank. What followed was chaos. I stayed back as promised, but watched as Demon transformed into something terrifying and magnificent. He moved through the battle like liquid violence, every motion precise and devastating. This was the Alpha King everyone feared. And for the first time, I truly understood why. But our small force couldn't hold against superior numbers forever. The raiders, realizing they'd been outmaneuvered, were trying to regroup. And in the confusion, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A group of raiders were dragging children toward the tree line. Hostages, I realized. They were going to use the children as leverage to escape. I didn't think. I just moved. Running toward them, I shouted in the most commanding voice I could muster, "Stop! In the name of the Alpha King, release those children." It was absurd. I had no weapons, no authority, no way to enforce the demand. But sometimes, audacity was its own weapon. The raiders stopped, confused by this blonde woman in fine clothes appearing from nowhere. One of them laughed, raising his sword. Then Demon was there, appearing between us like a nightmare made flesh. The raider's laugh cut off in a strangled gasp, as Demon's hand closed around his throat. "Touch her," Demon said, his voice absolutely dead calm. "And I will make sure you beg for death long before I grant it." The raider dropped his weapon. His companions followed suit, the children forgotten as they faced the full weight of the Alpha King's wrath. By the time the sun rose, it was over. The raiders who survived were in custody. The ambush had failed, and Millbrook was safe. Reeves's force had taken some casualties, but nothing catastrophic, thanks to our intervention. Demon found me in the village square, where I'd been helping tend to wounded soldiers and frightened villagers. He was covered in blood, none of it his, and looked exhausted. "That was the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever seen," he said, pulling me into his arms despite the audience of soldiers and villagers. "Don't ever do that again. I saved those children, and nearly gave me a heart attack." He pulled back to look at my face, his eyes intense. "Elena, when I saw you run toward those raiders, He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. Then he cupped my face in his hands and kissed me, right there in front of everyone. The watching crowd went absolutely silent. When he finally pulled away, he kept his hands on my face, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet dawn. "I love you, and I don't care who knows it anymore. I don't care about politics or propriety or what the council thinks. You're the bravest, most infuriating, most perfect person I've ever known, and I'm not hiding that anymore." Tears stung my eyes. "I love you too, even when you're being ridiculously overprotective." He laughed, the sound bright and genuine, and kissed me again. Around us, I heard murmurs from the crowd, but they weren't disapproving. They were approving? One of the village women was actually crying happy tears. A soldier clapped another on the shoulder, grinning. "Did you see her face down those raiders?" someone whispered. "Brave as anything. And the king. Did you see how he fought for her, for all of us?" The fear that had always surrounded Demon was shifting, transforming into something else. Respect. Admiration. Maybe even affection. We returned to the castle 3 days later, after ensuring Millbrook was secure and the raider situation fully resolved. The entire journey back, I noticed how differently people treated us. Villagers came out to wave as we passed. Soldiers smiled rather than averting their eyes. The fear was still there. You didn't stop fearing an apex predator just because he was in love. But it was tempered now by other things. The council meeting that followed was interesting. "Your Majesty," Lord Thorne began carefully, "we need to discuss the succession. In light of recent events and your attachment to Miss Winters, we feel it's important to establish—" "I'm going to marry her," Demon interrupted calmly. "Not as a political alliance, not for territorial gain. Because I love her and she loves me, and that's reason enough." The council erupted into protests. Too common, no political value, unprecedented, unacceptable. Demon let them vent for exactly 3 minutes. Then he stood, and the room fell silent. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. "I have spent my entire reign doing what was necessary for this territory. I've made hard decisions. I've sacrificed personal happiness for political stability. I've built a reputation that served our interests but cost me dearly. And through all of it, I've kept us safe and prosperous." He looked around the table, meeting each council member's eyes in turn. "Now I'm asking you to trust that this decision, however unconventional, is also the right one. Elena has proven herself brave, intelligent, and capable. She's earned the respect of my soldiers and my people. She sees things the rest of you miss. And she's the only person in this entire territory who isn't afraid to tell me when I'm wrong." "But Your Majesty," someone started. "This isn't a debate," Demon said flatly. "I'm informing you of my decision as a courtesy. The wedding will take place in 3 months. You may adjust your expectations accordingly." The silence that followed was profound. Then Lord Thorne, surprisingly, smiled. "Well then, I suppose we should begin planning a royal wedding." He looked at me with something that might have been respect. "Congratulations, future Queen Elena. Try to keep our king from doing anything too recklessly heroic, will you?" I returned his smile, feeling the weight of what had just happened settling over me. "I'll do my best, my lord, though he does make it challenging." Demon's hand found mine under the table, his fingers lacing through mine. The months that followed were a whirlwind. Wedding preparations, etiquette lessons, learning the intricacies of court politics from a queen's perspective rather than a servant's. It was overwhelming and exhausting, and occasionally terrifying. But through all of it, Demon was there, patient when I stumbled over formal protocols, encouraging when I doubted myself, proud when I succeeded. We were building something together, not just a marriage, but a partnership. The wedding itself was simpler than the elaborate affair that had been planned for Celestine. Demon insisted on it, wanting something genuine rather than purely political theater. We spoke our vows in the Great Hall, the same room where everything had fallen apart months before. But this time the atmosphere was completely different. There was no fear, just joy and hope, and the genuine celebration of 2 people who'd found each other against all odds. When Demon kissed me at the altar, sealing our union, the crowd erupted in cheers. Real cheers, not the polite applause of political obligation. That night, as we stood on the balcony of our private chambers, our chambers now, not just his, looking out over the territory that was now as much mine to protect as his, Demon pulled me close. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. I thought about the frightened girl I'd been just months ago, the one who'd been invisible, insignificant, too afraid to even dream of something like this. I thought about my mother, who'd taught me that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. "Not a single one," I said, rising on my toes to kiss him, "though I reserve the right to complain when royal duties get particularly tedious." He laughed, the sound warm and free. I wouldn't expect anything less. Far below, the castle was settling into sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were always challenges. Political maneuvering to navigate, threats to counter, the constant work of ruling. But tonight, we were just 2 people who'd found each other in the darkness and chosen to build something bright. The Alpha King everyone had feared had found his queen, not through political calculation or strategic alliance, but through something far more powerful: love, trust, and the courage to be honest, even when everything else demanded pretense. I'd walked into a ceremony as a nobody, been thrown out by forces beyond my control, and somehow ended up here, standing beside the most powerful man in the territory, as his equal, his partner, his choice. It wasn't the story anyone had expected, but it was ours, and that made it perfect.